Let's take another look at U.S. firearms laws, this time buying a firearm in the United States. Of course, this is strictly for entertainment purposes. We always encourage you to do your own research. We're going to take a look at three things in this video. First, ways you can legally obtain a firearm here in the United States. So often it's misportrayed in media or entertainment, and we just want to address how you can actually obtain a firearm, and then the laws that deal with those. Last, we'll look at why that matters. So there's a couple of different ways you can legally obtain a firearm here in the United States. First off, you could build one. Start from scratch, build it from parts. You could take one that's already built and buy it from someone else. You could buy it from someone else from a gun show, which is slightly different. You could get one as a gift. You could inherit one. You can get one at a gun shop, or another way of saying from a licensed dealer. So let's take a look at some of these different methods. First off, building a firearm. We recently did a video on this. We'll refer to that. But for the most part, there's a few federal restrictions on what you can build, and some of the shorter rifles and other things are going to require registration and perhaps a tax. But the only thing that's really restricted outright, and that's only fairly recently, would be full auto firearms. So since the beginning of the country, people have been able to build from scratch or from parts pretty much any firearm they wanted up until just recently. And that's just the way it's been. Now, as far as buying a firearm from someone else, again, it's fundamental. It's been like the exchange of personal property is something that's been around since the beginning of the country, and there's really no better way to express freedom than to privately sell or buy an instrument of freedom from another free individual. Now, there hasn't been any restrictions, as I mentioned, on private sales of firearms between individuals until 1934, where they defined and then required registration on certain firearms. So if you do the math, that's about 160 years before we had any kind of restrictions, or in this case registration, of any kind at the federal level. Then in 1968, we really got all of our modern or recent firearms restrictions, and those are created by the 1968 Gun Control Act. We'll take a much deeper look at that in a moment here. And then in 1986, some of those were refined or adjusted. So we have three major acts at the federal level of legislation that affected private sales, and for the most part, none of these really happened until just recently. And again, let's take a look at some of these in more depth. First, let's take a look at gun shows. Now, gun shows are basically swap meets for firearms. If you haven't been to a gun show, it's really nothing more than a bunch of people bring in their items that they want to sell, and people show up who want to buy them. So it's like a garage sale from a lot of people in one place. Now, they are unique in the respect that we'll talk about this in a little more in depth, but the people who are licensed to deal in firearms as a business can only do business at their stores and at gun shows. So while a gun show is a swap meet for firearms, it's also a place where licensed individuals are eligible to do business. Now, because of that, people think gun shows are somehow only for business, and they don't realize that private sales happen at gun shows just as much as purchases from dealers. Now, since the federal law does not require any kind of background check or any kind of waiting period between sales through individuals, people think of that as some kind of gun show loophole. So basically, private sales at a gun show are somehow the gun show loophole, and then depending on who you really talk to on the anti-freedom side, sometimes they'll consider all private sales the gun show loophole. We'll talk about that in future videos, but I figured it was worth touching on here. Now, we'll just mention briefly that all this data comes from a study back in 1987, so it's fairly dated, and I suspect the reason no one wants to fund any federal level research into this is they'll figure out that a lot of firearms are sold privately, but more are sold through their licensed dealers, and that won't help the anti-freedom sides. So again, we're talking about gun shows briefly here, but we'll talk about those more in other videos. Now let's talk about getting a firearm as a gift. For the most part, gifts are not restricted or tracked, and they're not regulated. So this can be a benefit if you're a free-loving person, or I guess a negative if you don't trust other people, because it's been like that, again, since the beginning of the country, and it's never been an issue for the most part that people are able to give firearms as gifts. Now let's talk about inheritance. For the most part, it's very much like gifts. They're not restricted, tracked, or regulated unless we're talking about NFA firearms. So if you hand down an NFA firearm, or a firearm that's restricted by the 1934 Gun Control or National Firearms Act, then you do have to do some transfer of ownership as well as a tax in some cases. Now let's get away from the ways you can obtain a firearm to look at some of the laws that deal with that. They can be broken down between existing laws and laws that have expired. So we have that 1934 National Firearms Act we talked about, which defined some firearms. And we have the 1968 Gun Control Act, which really created all of the restrictions on any type of purchase of firearms. And that's usually in the case of this licensing system and then the restriction on who can own a firearm. Then, of course, we have the background checks. Now, the assault weapons ban started in 1994 and it ended in 2004 and was not renewed. So it's expired. And then we have the Brady Bill, which also expired, ran concurrently, and its waiting periods have expired. However, we are left with the background check part of the Brady Bill. So let's again take a quick look at each of these real fast. So when we're talking about laws that affect buying a firearm in the United States, if we're talking about short firearms, machine guns, and the such, that's where we get some restriction from the 1934 NFA, and that's where we get our tax and our requirement to register those firearms. In 1968 was really where we get all of our gun control legislation that deals with purchasing firearms, and without actually reading the whole thing, which is definitely worth reading, we'll just address some of it here. Pretty much the Gun Control Act came out of the public concern over the violence that was happening in the late 60s, and so we created these restrictions in order to prevent future violence. The laws that regulate the firearms industry and firearms owners all come from 1968. It does this by regulating interstate commerce between firearms, or of firearms, between anyone except the licensed dealer. So by prohibiting the ability to sell firearms across state lines and then creating a licensing system to allow that to again take place, they in effect restricted the private exchange of firearms across state lines. That also created a minimum age for buying handguns, a minimum age for possessing handguns. It put 10 restrictions on the ownership of firearms. Those are the 10 questions that we see on the Form 4473. It created the licensing system for gunsmiths, manufacturers, importers, retail sales, as well as collectors. It required serial numbers and the creation of paperwork to record those serial numbers. And then, of course, it gave us the sporting use. So there's lots of stuff to talk about the Gun Control Act. A lot of it applies to buying firearms here in the United States because most of it is, well, a big chunk of it was to regulate that. So let's take a look at the parts that apply most. First off, the FFL system, or the Federal Firearms Licensee System. Again, it was created by the Gun Control Act, and it uses the regulation of firearms across interstate or state lines to create its legislation or its power. The licensee system for retail sales, gunsmiths, and manufacturers, as well as importers and collectors. And I think it's important to mention that, unlike some countries, the collector's license is not mandatory. In other words, it's something that you can pursue if you feel like it, but you don't need to in order to collect firearms. Now, the Gun Control Act of 1968 was edited, amended to an extent by the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act. So it's important to note that just because a piece of legislation is enacted doesn't mean that it can't be amended or hopefully repealed at some point. So it has been amended at one point and hopefully will be, many times, if not repealed in the future. So next, let's talk about the 4473, which is the form you fill out when you're buying a firearm from a licensed dealer. Now, that's only necessary when you're buying a firearm from a licensed dealer. It gives us the 10 restrictions on firearm ownership. Next, let's take a look at the Brady Bill. This is the bill that was created by the person who was shot during the assassination attempt on Reagan, and it went into effect in '94. It expired in '98, however, when the national background check system was created, and it was not extended. So it did create the national background check. It also required a waiting period. Again, the waiting period was deemed unnecessary since it didn't do anything to solve any problems, and it was expired in '98, and only a few states uh, have a waiting period. We'll take a quick look at that. The national background check, though, system did come from the Brady Bill and or the Brady Act. It was created in '98 as the Brady Act expired. It is run by the FBI. It is a system that determines if a buyer is prohibited from buying a firearm according to the 10 requirements of the 1968 Gun Control Act. Again, this is only necessary, or it's only applicable to purchases through licensed dealers, and it's accessed by the phone or the computer. It's only done in 30 states. It's not required by all states, but some states require more than background check provided by the NIC system. And since there's no federal waiting period, the dealer may transfer the firearm as soon as they complete the background check. So this is, again, something that's worthy of an entire video on its own, but this is the remnant of the Brady Act, which is an attempt to do a background check on people buying a firearm only from a licensed dealer. Next, we got waiting periods. Basically, we'll just sum it up to say there is no federal waiting period anymore. There was for just 4 years during the Brady Bill, or during the Brady Act. 11 states, however, and Washington, D.C., do require waiting periods, and we can see that those are the states with the highest crime rates. So, or a lot of the states with the highest crime rates. So I think you can make your own assumption on if that works or not. So I know this was a lot to cover. I just really wanted to go over some of the basics to basically move the knowledge along. A lot of times we see in the media this is portrayed in entertainment. It's completely portrayed incorrectly. So knowing the information, you can tell when you're being fed a line or not. We want to inspire other people to do research like this, help communicate this better, get this information out to other people and in better ways. We really hope this is a spark for more of that. So what you can bring home from this one is that we've never had any kind of federal restrictions against private sales of firearms between two free people since the beginning of the country. It's never been an issue. There's no reason for it to be an issue now. There's been no federal waiting period. Only 4 years we've barely had a waiting period. It was challenged and removed, and again, not necessary, not common sense. People are going to push for these things in the future, and it's to our benefit to know how you can buy a firearm. Hopefully this video will spark further discussion. Feel free to leave questions and comments and observations in the comment section for the video here. Get the word out. Keep talking to everybody. Here's the links that we use to create this video. We always encourage you to support the organizations that support our freedom. We post information like this on our websites. We always appreciate your support, and as always, thanks for watching.